All right, I think we're going to get started here. In a sec, sign-in sheets going around. Steve is unable to attend today. Kurt, we good? All right. Kicking off the study session today, we got two topics, or two updates. One's the update on the neighborhood traffic management program, and then we're also going to discuss residential speed limits. That kind of ties into the neighborhood program. So Dustin is going to lead off with an update of the program.
We'll start off just a little background real quick. The neighborhood traffic management program is a more comprehensive program than our previous traffic calming, and we're going to attempt to address through the 5 E's: education, encouragement, enforcement, evaluation, engineering. We've had our work plan for 2019 and 2020 reviewed by this body and approved by the City Commission. So I'll jump ahead to the second page of the where we are and where we're headed. The summary of progress. We have executed the agreement with Alta for professional services to develop the public outreach campaign and implement that in August when the students come back. We're currently testing equipment to collect volume and speed data and to determine the best equipment to purchase that will meet our needs. And we've also researched the temporary traffic calming materials, like temporary speed humps, rubber curb, things like that, and we'll be purchasing those soon also. So that leads into the next steps. In the next 30 to 90 days, we have the kickoff meeting scheduled with Alta for February 13th for the public education campaign. The next month or so, we'll be finalizing our decision on the speed and volume collection equipment and making those purchases. And then also purchasing the temporary traffic calming equipment. And then once we have all that equipment, we'll be able to do some of our data collection to determine the best when and where for the targeted enforcement. And then we also are assembling a staff team to develop the process and start the selection for the neighborhood for the pilot study. And then that leads into our big meat of tonight's meeting, which is discussing the residential speed limits.
Any questions on?
Any questions on that?
Talk about this after the residential speed limits, or are we gonna...
If you have questions on this specifically, we can talk about those now.
I'd like to understand better the traffic calming equipment, like what's being considered. Like, is it just like the rubber versions of what we typically see, or is it the speed signs that kind of flash when you're going too fast? I mean, can you give us some sense of?
So it both are included. The speed feedback signs can also collect the data, and so that's kind of where we're leaning, is we can provide that feedback as well as get data when the sign's not on. So a little bit of kind of before and after is built into it. And then the traffic calming equipment is more like the infrastructure, the rubber speed humps, or temporary speed hump, or temporary curb bump outs that you can put in, delineators, things to try and help people realize how fast they're going.
Will Alta be involved in helping you kind of select the kind of devices based on their experiences?
They're not really involved in that piece of it.
Okay, the other E's, right?
They're doing more the education engagement.
Okay, cool.
So the devices you're considering are devices that we already have, that we've used before, like bumps and
Well, we don't have any temporary devices now that we can go out and we've only put in permanent speed humps, so concrete, asphalt speed humps. This would give us the ability to test them out, see if they're effective or not before we spend a lot of money to put in permanent speed bumps.
Well, the reason I was asking, I was thinking, I can remember seeing quite a while ago now, where there were strategically placed dead-end streets in the middle, like 27th Street splitting it in half, or I'm not saying that because I'm suggesting it, but just doing land use things rather than traffic control things. Is that a possibility? Things like putting a stop sign far enough back that it includes the sidewalk and one car in front.
Well, that might be more of a design details with the placement of the stop sign, but as far as the layout of the streets, that's something that would be looked at through the planning process. And so having streets that aren't straight, long streets that have the ability for vehicles to go quickly is something that we look at when we're designing streets. And then if there are, putting the traffic calming in with the street or the subdivision. So there's some review that's done when we're doing the street layout for new subdivisions.
Back when we were on the task force, one of the things I happened across was this rule that one community was using, that a collector street was not a through street. The collector street did its job collecting and sending out and collecting and bringing it in, but you could not drive through it. And I don't remember the details or where it was, but I was thinking, there are other things out there that we haven't tried yet.
Well, I would say we've tried that
Oh, okay.
on the pop-up project for the Bike Boulevard with 13th Street. It's a local street, and we tried that, and it was not well received. Let's just put it that way. Therefore, the final plans did not include that. So I think that's larger project discussions as we go in and reuse streets, but I don't think it's, in our one attempt so far, something that has been very well received in the community.
So it might be something to consider for new development rather than existing development. Okay, I have a couple of other questions. You said you were going to collect data on volume. How are you planning to use data on volume?
What do you mean, how are we?
Well, my claim is in a neighborhood, volume is not the problem, it's behavior.
It depends. If you're talking cut-through traffic, volume sometimes is indicative of cut-through traffic, which is a lot of the complaints we would see with the speed humps. There was part of this old speed hump policy that was based on what percentage of the traffic was cut-through traffic, because if you slow the traffic down, the thought is people are probably taking some of these side streets because they feel it's faster than taking the streets taking 6th Street. And so volume can indicate issues with probably a street that's easier to travel at a faster speed than it probably should be. So I think we're looking in that aspect.
Well, for example, there are 20 houses on our street, and yet we have 100 cars going through. And most of the people on our street are retired, so those 100 cars are definitely not local. However, we didn't qualify for anything under the rules at the time. If you're studying, are you studying one neighborhood or a couple of neighborhoods? How are you doing that?
So the initial kind of rollout until we have picked a neighborhood for the pilot program is going to be kind of scattered around the city. We're going to use several sources of previous data to kind of determine where we're going to go out and start that effort. Once we've developed this program, this pilot program, we'll probably put a little more emphasis on that one neighborhood that we've selected for the program this year. That's something we would like to, do one this year, see how it works. Maybe next year do another one or two, and just kind of work our way around through the neighborhoods. So the first effort's going to be just really more citywide while we're developing this program, so we can start getting the enforcement out there. But yeah, it'll eventually be a little more focused down to one area that we're doing the pilot program.
Okay, I'm glad you brought up citywide. When we study the neighborhoods, are we going to study them in context or in isolation? I mean, you can isolate a neighborhood and say this is going on inside the neighborhood, but sometimes it's impacted by what's outside the neighborhood.
Well, we're going to probably determine a approximate size of what we want to consider as a neighborhood, because that's kind of generic. I think if we said neighborhood association, that would be, some are very large and some are very small. We're going to have to define what that is, and there's going to be some context of what's around their schools and different generators, but we're going to really try to, the focus is on the neighborhood streets, not the arterial streets around it.
Well, the arterial streets, the speed on the arterial streets does impact the neighborhoods, though.
Yes, but this program specifically states, and it's approved in the way the program's approved per the ordinance, that it will not have any improvements on arterial streets. If there was something needed on an arterial street identified as part of this program, it could potentially go into a CIP request for a larger project, but this program was not intended to address issues that are on a more major street. This was really.
But can we identify them?
I think it could potentially identify issues that could feed into a larger project. We just didn't want this program to be suddenly diverted away to doing something in major intersections when the real focus was in neighborhoods when it was developed as the traffic calming program. So we wanted to make sure we were staying kind of true to that. So, and these speed humps weren't allowed on arterial streets, so it seemed like a very good kind of kept the program as a similar scope to say that that was excluded from the program. So.
Thank you.
I'm not sure they're, you'd mentioned the traffic calming device on 13th Street for the Bike Boulevard that was tried. And I had heard from a couple people in East Lawrence that the reason for, I don't know exactly what happened there, for whatever happened was that people didn't think it would be on 13th Street. I have no idea whether this is the actual case, but was there anything that indicated that might actually be the case? It wasn't so much the traffic calming device that was placed there, it was where it was placed that people thought it was not appropriate for the location.
I know
outside
this
of
is
the
a
little
feedback of,
hot, yeah,
of just the neighborhood.
yeah.
The other feedback we got from people in the city who use that as a through street, there was a lot of, I want to turn left there. I want to be able to go through there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of it was neighborhood specific, and some of it was people outside of the neighborhood that also, I think people get into patterns, and it's very hard to change that pattern.
So what I'd heard from the neighborhood was that the bike boulevard was in the wrong place, that it needed to be over a block or something, but I never.
That's a whole different subject. I do not think that was the reason why primarily people were against what was going on at that intersection.
Okay. I was just wondering, because I was like, is it a bad thing to use somewhere in town?
I'll just say that every place that we, even on 21st Street, that we have recommended diverters or things like that, there is definitely people who love and hate it. So it's a very sensitive subject, so I think it's got to be part of a bigger project, more, or if a neighborhood comes and requests, hey, we'd like this street, that's different than us going in and saying, hey, we're going to make this street a dead end now. Now, we are going to do a few diverters on 21st Street, but there was definitely people who like and don't like it. So it's just something we've got to be very thoughtful about, and generally, a lot of those too, some of them can be pretty high cost, like what we're doing at Louisiana Street and 21st, it's fairly expensive to do that, where this program's supposed to address really some more lower cost solutions than a big project would. So, yeah, I'm not saying we won't ever do that. I will just say, like, I just wanted to make the point that we have experimented with things like that, and we should continue to, but thoughtfully.
So I'm thinking of requests we've had in the past that deal more with getting people safely across streets, like pedestrians mostly. So I think it was Monterey that there was a request a couple years ago about getting across there, and we've had a couple requests, I think basically the same request from Old West Lawrence, getting across Tennessee. How do you see the having these temporary devices and such, how's that going to help with those situations where it's mostly about just people wanting to find a safe way to get across a street that is probably not regarded as a neighborhood street, but it's impacting the neighborhoods. So it's maybe a Collector Street, you know, for neighborhoods to visit other neighborhoods, especially visiting a park or like in case of Old West Lawrence going to downtown.
I think slowing traffic down is going to be key to making people feel comfortable crossing it, walking along it, crossing it. So we may, in future years, focus more on yielding to pedestrians and those things. This year, kind of everything seemed to focus, a lot of the complaints around speed. And even when you talk about all those crossing things, it all goes back to speed. On Monterey Way, it was people are going too fast for me to cross. Yep. The same on Tennessee. So I think if we deal with the speed issue, hopefully there is some kind of benefit to the crossing.
I guess what I was trying to get clear about is these cases where it's not a neighborhood street, but it's a street that is on the border of a neighborhood? Is that?
Yeah, so those are both collector streets, so they would
Right.
be considered, if we had a boundary, we could consider that as
Okay.
part of it. Where arterial streets would be, obviously, you know, we're not going to be looking necessarily doing improvements on 6th Street or 23rd Street, but both Monterey Way and Tennessee are collector streets.
Okay. So they would fit inside the scope of the neighborhood
Yeah.
program, okay.
You good? Okay. So I think we wanted to just start a conversation here about this residential speed limits because it's something we brought up when we proposed this work plan, and I don't think we're prepared necessarily to have a staff recommendation on what we think is the right approach. We wanted to have more of an open discussion at this point. We've got some members of the community here that are interested in this discussion. They've been emailing and calling us about these things, so we informed them about this topic tonight. And just wanted to really kind of inform you guys on what the state statute is, what the city code is, kind of some initial research we've done, and open it up for discussions about what we see as a way forward. We do want to move this pretty quickly if it's something we want to do, because we'd like to roll it in with the enforcement and with the education campaign that we're about to start with. I think it's going to be critical to, you can't just go change the signs and expect compliance. There's got to be, you know, the education, the enforcement, all of those things that play into it to really make it successful. So a little background, there's state statute sets these statutory speed limits here, and the city adopts the standard traffic ordinances, and that basically refers back to the state statute and sets a lot of the speed limits. That's what the 30 miles per hour kind of default lies in that. We do have some streets in the community that have been lowered to 20 miles per hour. I don't know if we have any at 25. I think we've got several.
There's a few.
Is there a few at 25? So it's kind of been street by street in the past, where a neighborhood might come in and say, hey, we want the street to be lowered to 20. So over the years, I think there's been several of those, but we wanted to have a conversation about, is it something we would rather just do community-wide? So this section of the state statute basically says that local authorities can, on the basis of an engineering and traffic investigation, reduce the speed limit. It says that you can't go less than 20 in a residential district, but it does give you the flexibility to go down to 20 miles per hour. And then our city code says that it needs to be established by ordinance. So we'd be looking at some type of ordinance, whether that be a charter ordinance or just an ordinance that would change that if that's the direction we wanted through city commission. So Dustin has reached out to a few cities, and we found, I'm sure there's probably more in just our preliminary research, we found at least 5 who reduced their residential speed limits to 25 miles per hour, and I have them listed here. Most of those, it's been in place for a very long time, so there was no current staff members that could really talk to us about the process they went through for that. Again, we kind of said that this should really be tied into the other efforts we're doing. We also have in this year's work plan kind of $100,000 just set aside for signage. So if this is something we want to do and that we move forward with, we would want to go in and place speed limit signs, which you probably know there's not a lot of them on local streets right now. There's some, but there's not a lot of them. So all the local streets would need to get the speed limit signage to really enforce that kind of reinforce that speed limit is lower. So we have about $100,000. We've done an initial look. It's probably in the neighborhood of 1,000 signs. We'd have to get more in details with that. That's just kind of an estimate at this point. And if we are interested in that, staff would need to conduct more research, consult with legal to develop the staff recommendation, and then we would bring it back to this body, hopefully at the March meeting, to then go to City Commission with the recommendation. And then we attached some articles here for reference, just some kind of recent articles. If you read about it, you'll find that it's very split on whether it makes a difference. There's one study in Boston that has shown some reduction in speeds. What I found in reading those is everybody addressed, if you just change signs, will it have an impact? And that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about changing signs, doing education, doing enforcement. And I really couldn't find any studies or articles that addressed an approach that did all of that and what was the impact. So I don't think we have an answer on whether it's going to help or not. I would hope it's helpful. We invited police department here to kind of be able to hopefully say what they think as far as the enforcement piece. But
yeah, so we're very excited to work with Amanda and her crew on this. We think that police resources will be spent very well knowing where we need to be, when we need to be, and what the problems are. Oftentimes, these calls come in, one person might call on a vehicle or vehicles. By the time we get there, it's crickets, and we've spent our time chasing nothing. With what Amanda and her team are suggesting, we will be using our resources wisely. It'll be targeted at the right times, the right places, the right days of the week, with officers who will go out and take enforcement action, issue citations, warnings, make traffic stops, and kind of help that educational process. So if this gets into a 25 versus a 30 mile an hour conversation and the city decides to do that, I think it's critical to continue down that and use our resources where they need to be versus guessing.
So, Amanda, would this be used in conjunction with the neighborhood traffic management program and do neighborhood by neighborhood?
I think we would look at rolling out the speed limit citywide. Yeah, it would just make it easier, I think, to do citywide. We would have to figure out the timing of it all, because obviously we can't go put signs up in one day everywhere. But so there would probably have to be somewhat of we pass the ordinance and there's a process if we're going through putting the signs up. Once the signs are up, then we work with them on, okay, enforcement's in this area at this time. And we'll work on a plan to do that. And then we would look at rolling it into the education campaign. So maybe the message is tailored to the fact that it's now a lower speed limit versus just a general, hey, we need to drive slower on neighborhood streets. We might be able to target it more specifically to a message that reiterates that. So yeah, we'd be looking at citywide rollout. And then the enforcement would probably be just kind of sporadic around the city based on data we go out and collect.
Is there a inclination towards 25 over 20 or 20 over 25?
Yeah.
We don't have any. I mean, and Amanda pointed out we have some neighborhoods where we've done 20, some were 25. These other communities we looked at were 25. Yeah.
Do we know in neighborhoods where we've changed the speed limit? Is there a before and after kind of study to look at, or just anecdotally, do we know that there's
Yeah, I don't know if we've routinely done after studies, but without having some enforcement periodically, I don't know if it would make a big difference just to lower the speed limit. So I think, as Amanda pointed out, it's the whole effort, all the E's. So most of them, when we've changed the speed limits, we've changed them and haven't done any follow-up speed studies, but
I would say though, in several of those, with the old program, we would change the speed limit one year, and the next year we'd get a speed hump
Yep.
request. Now, guess what? The speed limit was 10 miles an hour lower, so it qualified because people were going the same speed, but now they were more over the speed limit, which rise them to the top of the list on the traffic calming list. So there was several like that.
Yeah, there was. Yeah, it felt like a game.
It was a game. It was, well, you didn't qualify. Okay, lower the speed limit. Okay, now we qualify.
Yeah.
Yep. So I'm wondering, when people make their decision about the speed they travel and they choose to go 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, is there any truth to that being an acceptable practice by law enforcement? Because I think that might help us make the decision about what's the right speed limit to set if we know that there won't be enforcement until 6 miles or more above the speed limit or whatever. You know, like that's just kind of folklore, but what is the true effectiveness of, if we're going to add in an element of enforcement, at what point is it actually enforced?
Each officer has their own measure on that.
Okay.
I know of no officers that enforce at 1 mile over the speed limit. We could stay busy on that.
Right.
And only that. Plus, I think the town would hate us.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll be contested.
We try to have a fair and reasonable approach to this, to where the officers have some leeway to, hey, they're coming down a hill, or
Right.
whatever the case may be. There's not a number I can give you, but let's say, for example, the speed limit in your neighborhood is 30 miles an hour. A car doing 35 or 36 or 37 might not reach someone's threshold. But if the speed limit was 25, I think it would certainly reach that threshold. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you are, if you have that 5 mile an hour difference in those neighborhoods like you're talking about, I think that does kind of push that a little closer to meeting that threshold, whatever that officer's number might be. Mine was always a little closer.
I actually have some numbers that I brought. If you're driving 70 miles per hour, a 5 mile per hour increase is 7% increase. If you're supposed to be driving 30 miles per hour and you go 5 miles over, it's a 17% increase. Not only that, we should take into consideration what the driver is thinking at those different speeds. A driver at 25 miles per hour is thinking much differently than a driver at 30 miles an hour.
Yeah, and I think there's also a lot of, if you look at some of the cities that have went to this, like where they're trying to get to the zero fatalities, traffic fatalities, and you start looking at some of the data of really the injuries that occur, 25 miles an hour to 30 miles per hour being hit by a vehicle going that small of, 5 miles per hour difference, the survival rate is much higher at 25 miles per hour than it is at 30. So you start talking small changes in a neighborhood where people are crossing and kids are playing. There will still, the whole thing with the Zero Vision program is that, or Vision Zero, is there will still be accidents and there will still be mistakes made, but if they're made at lower speeds, the impact is much less. And so I think that's too what we'd be looking for, is we know there's still going to be crashes and we know there's still going to be people not paying attention. But if they're at least driving at a slower speed, they have a little more time to react when something happens, and if something does happen, that hopefully that it's not a fatality. So,
Well, that, and in your neighborhoods, you have multimodal transportation, so you have scooters and bicycles and skateboards and whatever, too. So if we can lower the speeds, that would be better.
I have a question, and it's not residential speeds, but it's whether any additional, like when we do this, there are any additional streets that would be considered to reduce the speed limit. And the one that I constantly think about, and it's maybe a little unfair because it's the one that I'm constantly on, is Clinton Parkway. It's a 45 mile an hour road, but I know the 85th percentile speed, I think some data was done on that a couple years ago, was 53. Yeah, you're on that road too. Yeah. And so I've looked at that road is constantly, I'm on it, and I think it feels like everybody goes a little over 45, and that's approaching, highway speeds in town. And I've always thought, I know there's that sort of question of what would it do, but I think it's that if it were lowered to 40, then people, now people feel comfortable going 53, that almost 10 miles an hour over, and if it were lowered to 40, they probably would drop a little bit because, so I'm sure there's probably another street or two like that in town. I think we looked at one, I'm trying to remember, it was Louisiana, maybe, down by Broken Arrow in South, or Billy Mills. So I was just wondering if there were any other streets that we could consider with that.
South of Billings.
South of Billings.
Yeah, we did some data on that actually with one of our demos, and I was like, oh, man, especially about 7 in the morning going south for some reason.
Or even Billings
Oh,
going down
lot.
by University Police down that hill. But
Yeah.
you get down to the bottom of the hill, nobody's going the speed limit by the time they get down to the bottom of that hill.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Katie,
Unless you've locked your brakes up.
Katie works that one a lot. So.
And I think we can have like larger discussions at one point. We wanted to keep for this program, obviously focused on the local streets, and I do think this is a critical, the timing on this one's pretty critical because of the education campaign. I think there can be larger discussions, maybe that this is step one and there's a phase 2 that goes on to say, hey, we had success here, let's roll this into here, but yeah, I
I
think.
was just thinking sometimes it feels like in Lawrence it's easier to push it all out at one time.
We're just pretty constrained in time to still get this education campaign out by August, so that's where I'm being selfish in this program, being that I want to make sure we're successful with this program, and
Well, I think
we could get into very large discussions about that.
I appreciate your interest in trying to, coordinate that, because I think there's been some public reaction to the idea of having a consultant, and if it's not understood within the broader picture of what we're trying to accomplish, it's easy to think, well, why does the city need to hire someone to tell us to slow down? But if it's around, like, we're trying to really make a broad change to how we drive and changing the speed limit and educating the public about that, that seems, I don't know, on its face more justified than spending $100,000 just to hire someone to tell people to slow down, So is the question, I guess the question I have is, what's the process look like for us to make a recommendation for the speed limit change? Is that something that you're expecting us to do, to present a recommendation to the city commission? And how would we do that?
Do you want to speak to that, or?
Well, we're just, I don't know if we have an answer, because, we kind of discussed 20 or 25, what's appropriate, and I don't think, we have an answer on, but I guess to your question on how to get public feedback, if there's, we want to, I guess we're just kind of throwing this out there today to see what we hear, and then see if we need to do any other kinds of public engagement to get feedback from folks before we make a recommendation. So yeah, we haven't found any good data that shows 20 or 25 miles an hour, or from these other cities around the area that have done that, what process they went through. It doesn't seem like they went through any process. They just chose a speed limit. And
Did Alta, have they given you any input on a particular speed?
No, we talked to them a little bit more, the Bicycle Boulevard, about that, because we are going to do a 20 mile per hour reduction with that for this 21st Street specifically along the Bicycle Boulevard, because you're really there, you're encouraging bicycles and vehicles to mix. But we hadn't, I don't think, as far as the education campaign, that's not really what was in their scope. It was, they're really more public engagement experts than they are the group that we have probably doing this, than they really are the engineering side of Alta. So that wasn't really something I don't think we asked them to weigh in on this. But yeah, I've had some discussions with Alta on the Bike Boulevard, and they really felt for that specific street, 20 miles per hour was the appropriate. So some cities had actually went to like 18 or 17, because then it's this odd number that catches your eye. Per state statute, we can't go below 20. So those are probably in other states where they didn't have that in place.
Has anyone in Kansas lowered it to 20?
We haven't found any.
Okay.
I think there's some streets, and some were like in industrial areas, those type of things, but in residential, everyone that we found was 25. But there, and I'm sure there's more cities. We've done just some real cursory review.
Well, given that we've had multiple cities set a speed limit of 25, that seems like a pretty reasonable kind of thing to start with, to say, hey, other communities have done this. It sounds like our approach is going to be even more sophisticated, with the ability to collect data, have targeted enforcement as an option. I mean, I haven't heard if you've found out other cities doing something like that. It doesn't sound like it. So it feels like if there's a way to set a rule that we think works, and then have an enforcement mechanism that's efficient, that feels like a pretty major improvement from what we currently have. I'd be comfortable trying to present that and getting a public reaction to how would people react to trying to slow themselves down to 25. I mean, one thing you know is if you try to get across town, that 5 miles an hour difference isn't going to change a lot. You know, you're going to get somewhere 75 seconds faster, maybe, if you hit it right, if you don't hit a stoplight. I mean, the stoplights are going to do more to slow you down than
The speed limit.
yeah.
Did I hear that the neighborhoods would be involved in their studies?
In the pilot program? Yeah, so when we do that, we got a staff team that we're putting together to put together this program and then present it to the Transportation Commission before we roll it out. But we would be asking for a certain number of representatives from the neighborhood to participate with us to kind of help develop what we were going to do in that neighborhood. So we may say we want 3 representatives from the neighborhood to be kind of the committee from that group to help us. So they would be involved.
Just as a kind of random aside, if you have the point of conducting more research on not just lower speed limits, but also how to enforce lower speed limits, oddly enough, the city of Williston, North Dakota, anecdotally speaking, does an amazing job of not making people go over the speed limits. I don't think I've ever seen such a well-disciplined traffic populace. It's almost kind of uncanny, because people truly do drive exactly the speed limit, and this is in an area of like oil field roughnecks and farmers who aren't used to really obeying those kind of things. So it's very interesting to see how they did it. And as far as I can tell, it's just extensive enforcement over a long enough period of time that people get the point. You know? All right, not going to do that anymore. So I don't know if the call to them is warranted, just in terms of how much enforcement does it take to get the point across, or is it the magnitude of the fines, or is it points on your license? I don't know what it would be, but.
In the military, it's pretty clear. If you're on a military base, you better not go above the speed limit. In fact, you're best just going below it.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. Enforcement can make a huge difference, and people learn quickly, how seriously the rules are followed and taken. So
I'd just be curious to see if it's the frequency of enforcement or the severity of the fine, or a combination of the two.
I think a lot of it's the visibility of seeing you guys out doing it, because I might not get pulled over, but I just saw, oh man, I just went by and they had somebody pulled over. And so I'm not even getting the fine or getting pulled over, but I'm seeing it happen to other people. And like, hey, I should probably slow down.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my own personal thought with what would probably affect me.
I really like the idea of trying to kind of package this all together. I think it's going to be much more effective than just doing one piece at a time. Or I'd like to hear the public's thoughts on this, if anyone's here to talk about it. If that's, I don't know what.
Yeah. Well, if there's no other questions, we could, we got 20 minutes.
Yeah.
We could,
Okay.
if there's any public
Yes, here.
feedback, we could, maybe a couple minutes each.
All right, KT.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your service. My name is Katie Walsh. I'm on the board of the East Lawrence Neighborhood Association. So I just have a few things I've been noting. I think it surprised me that Alta is only going to work with KU, because this city commission and the city government's so committed to inclusion at this point. And automatically, usually, when we include the university, we include Haskell, our other university. So I was surprised. I'm sorry?
I wasn't sure where that,
Alta is working with the city of Lawrence.
Yeah, not,
Right, but they said they were going to also work with KU. It's in the proposal. They're going to reach out to KU. So I just
Oh,
thought
from
maybe
the
Haskell
proposal.
should also be included.
yeah, and we can. I think we were trying to hit, it was recommended from West Lawrence when we met with them last week. Came in and we met with a representative there that we reach out to someone at KU because there's such a large student population there to really make sure that the message is getting delivered there also. But I do think it's a good point about Haskell.
How much do speed limit signs cost? You've got that $100,000.
Doing the math sounds like 1,000 a pop.
Well, yeah, it's about 100, probably with the post, the sign. It
The labor.
depends, what's that?
And the labor.
Yeah, the labor, and it kind of depends how many you're doing too, so, but yeah, you're probably about $100.
Can you double up on other city signs? Can you double up on poles we already have out there?
Sometimes you can, it just depends, we can't do, the power poles unless we have agreements, so, but yeah, so it just depends. And there's some neighborhoods that already have signs, but they would go from 30 to 25, so in those, it would be cheaper. We did a real rough estimate.
Okay. Could an afterstay be done in the Brook Creek neighborhood since they're getting funds to lower theirs this year?
So theirs have been in place.
Oh, they're already in place.
Right, it's
I didn't know
it's just putting the pavement markings down to reinforce that, which was a grant, a CDBG grant.
Could they do an after-study then?
We could to see the impact of the pavement markings.
And let's see, is there, I don't know this, so maybe there's a scientist here. Is there an environmental benefit of going 20 miles an hour versus 30 miles per hour in terms of particles and wear and tear on the streets, et cetera?
I mean, there's probably a marginal decrease in brake dust generation, but that's about all I can think of.
Okay.
Otherwise, I think the engines burn about as efficiently at outer speed, so
Okay. And lastly, thank you, those were all good answers.
I'm here for it.
In East Lawrence, we have heavy development going on in the eastern part of our neighborhood, this so-called Arts District. It was called that because the developer decided to call it that, by the way. Anyway, this year, we're gonna have 100+ bedrooms built down there. So our neighborhood is super concerned because all the traffic, all the parking, it's really hard to get your kids to New York school. It's really hard to get your kids to Hobbs Park. So that's 11th Street, and I mean, it's just really hard. Parents are complaining that we can't take our kids to these places we want to take our kids. And so not only are we in favor of the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, we'd love to have it this year, but we also need some help on process of how to get more stop signs or how to make it safe for kids. So thank you, that's what I've got.
Thanks, KT.
Hi, Phil Collison, and I'm also with the East Lawrence Neighborhood Association, but I'm speaking for myself. Although we've all agreed that we want to do 20-mile-an-hour speed limits, Old West Lawrence, signs would be great for residential streets, and so we're not talking arterials, and I think 9th, 11th, 13th are arterials. And I'm going to reiterate, people are starting to notice that it's really hard to get from the northern part of the neighborhood across 9th Street, across Delaware Street to get to Hobbs Park. And I guess I'm going to mention the 13th Street Bike Boulevard because I think that its status right now is that they want to see the 21st Street one get built so that they have a better sense of what's the impact. My personal opinion is that 13th Street is already the nicest street to ride your bike down and doesn't need amenities on it to help because I don't think they're going to help the bicyclist that rides on the street be safer. It's really makes everybody feel really good. And in my opinion, when you have to, if I'm riding down the street, I want to be on the right side of the street, and if I have to if there's an obstacle in my way and I have to go out into the lane that the cars are now in, which is what the bicycle narrowing devices, or the lane narrowing devices do, I feel less safe, because now I have to make sure that there's not a car there, that there's more obstacles in it that I have to consider, and I can't just ride my bike and have a car go by me. And anything that does allow more kids to be able to ride their bikes on the street would be a really good thing, and I don't think that these bicycle boulevards are going to be safe enough for kids, for parents to think that their kids can ride on those streets safely. And like I said, 13th Street is one of the nicest streets already to ride on. Connecticut Street, on the other hand, is a narrow street that has sharrows on it that is one of the worst streets to ride your bike on. And and so if we're going to spend money to improve riding in Lawrence, I think that we ought to do it on streets that are the most unsafe, and that's Connecticut Street. And we should talk to more bicyclists about where do they ride and what do they need, and in order to do that. But thank you for letting me share.
Hello, I'm Michael Allman, Sustainability Action Network, but also Brook Creek Neighborhood. Thanks for the opportunity. As far as how effective lowering the speed limit may be, like KT mentioned, Brook Creek, a part of Brook Creek Neighborhood is kind of a test case, because we've had 20-mile-an-hour posted speed limits in the north half of Brook Creek Neighborhood, gosh, for, I think, since 2000, so for at least 20 years. And basically with no enforcement. And it was, like Amanda said, just posting the signs. It really didn't do much because people kept speeding and running stop signs. And the way that we measured it was not if people are speeding, which what does that mean, but what percentage of the drivers are speeding. And over the years, that percentage has dropped. So it actually was and is effective, but it's taken about 20 years, as a kind of a passive post a sign and wait and see what happens. So I really value this holistic whole system, with a W, whole system approach to deal with speed limits, control devices, education. For a few years, I would kind of jokingly criticize the program, the traffic safety program, as being a one-trick pony. Speed hump, speed hump, speed hump, speed hump, and nothing else. So this, I think, is a definite improvement. I'm really grateful. And on that, I could suggest a couple things that, may or may not resonate and may or not work in your estimation, but I think they may. After doing a pilot program in a particular neighborhood or section or whatever you want to call it, and getting some feedback and understanding more clearly what might work or what might not, I would think that when you want to ramp this up to a full-blown program, put more money to it, whatever you're going to do, that the speed limits by ordinance be set globally, everywhere, on every residential street, all at one time, so that the general populace knows this is happening. Instead of this piecemeal, this little area, that's going to get real confusing, and people aren't going to be as aware. And if they're aware that it's happening on all residential streets, and it's publicized, like in the Flame or wherever, however, that could be part of the educational program. So that's a thought. The the your speed signs like we're testing right now, how many are there out there?
There's two, we're gonna get
There's
two more
two.
in.
Oh,
We're gonna
okay.
get two more in.
Okay.
Try 'em.
I like the solar one I emailed
Yeah, and
you.
that one can be made solar too, we're just trying.
Oh, good. Oh, okay, because I think it's just a dead battery.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's an older battery that's,
Yeah, okay.
the volume of traffic there is killing it quickly.
Yeah, but it was working well. I like it.
It's not a great placement, but we were more testing the functionality.
Okay. I would think effectiveness could be enhanced if, like within one car length, one way or the other, there is a posted 20 miles an hour and your speed is. So people say, oh. You know,
Yeah,
just a thought.
we would plan on that when we do full installs.
Okay.
So,
Yeah,
but I
good.
appreciate you noticing those.
Okay. And let's see, speed humps. You know, I'm not opposed to speed humps. I mean, there are quite a few in town that I think are very effective. And, but there's a lot of difference in the design of some of these speed humps. If you've gone over various speed humps, you know by the feel of them. And what it has to do with is the cross-sectional form of that speed hump. How wide that cross-section is, first of all, how high it is. I mean, this may be rudimentary, but, you know, just saying we have some temporary speed humps, what design is that going to be? Some have a straight, flat incline. Some are parabolically arched, which is a much more aggressive, when you reach it, you feel it more. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to design them. So you might have 2 or 3 different types, I thought. So that's all. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Peggy Robinson, and I live at 743 New York Street. I'm here to encourage you to reduce the speed limit to 20 miles an hour all over town as soon as possible. It seems to be a kind of a common sense thing to do, safety-wise and whatnot. Also want to comment on 25 versus 20. I feel like there would be a significant cost in labor and money, changing all the signs from 30 to 25, which to me, 5 miles an hour doesn't seem like a lot of difference. I'm sure it would be better than 30, but I really support 20 miles an hour. And I think that's a lot of labor and a lot of money to do that across the city. And I also agree with the comments about East Lawrence being heavily developed, a lot more traffic, a lot more cars, a lot more cut-through traffic, which is another good reason to have it at 20 to discourage the cutting through, because it shouldn't be faster to cut through. I don't really quite understand why people aren't taking 11th Street directly to Connecticut, although there has been kind of an ongoing water leak around 11th in New Jersey that's been going on for months and maybe even years that might, and frankly, I'm starting to avoid it myself, especially when the temperature drops and you're looking at ice. So I'm not really sure what's going on with that leak, but if that were fixed, that might really help encourage people to use 11th Street more regularly, as opposed to cutting through down Delaware and up 8th and all that stuff. 8th Street definitely is really bad. People coming from downtown heading east just floor it sometimes going down 8th Street. And there are some kids that cross there to go to New York school. And I would just really hate to see something happen to anyone on 8th Street. I have seen a wreck at 8th in Connecticut. It'd be great to have enforcement there too, or some signage like one of those yellow signs that say, cross traffic does not stop. I don't know if you're addressing getting out of bounds here, but mostly I just want to really strongly encourage the 20 mile an hour speed limit as soon as possible throughout the city of Lawrence. And thank you very much for your service here. Appreciate it.
Thanks for your comments.
Hi there, Gary Weber, President, Sunset Hill Neighborhood Association. Really happy to see you addressing residential speed limits. 25 sounds like a good number to me. I think 20 is going to make more people angry and get less done than 25. 20 seems incredibly slow, and I think you're going to get a lot of pushback at 20 miles an hour. I think 25, and part of the reason I say that is because you've had such difficulty finding communities adopting 20 mile an hour residential. I think it's unusually low. So 25, you found some examples of communities that adopted a 25 mile an hour residential. I think that's a good place to start. I like the 5 E's. It's so critical that you do this well. And I want to make one warning as you hire your consultant. It's going to generate a lot of good stuff that you're going to push out there to the community. I want to encourage you to try to use as many different vehicles as you can possibly use. Neighborhood association newsletters, the Flame, little private newsletters, the Senior Monthly. You know, there are all sorts of small publications that need a pre-written small articles, well done, with good points that they can publish in their newsletters. So reach out to those folks, give them some good copy, and they'll put it out to the community. Also, next door, social media, you know all about these things. Now, what I want to caution you about is what happens sometimes in a bureaucracy, and that is one group within the bureaucracy will make a piece of information or a media posting, and it's really good, but implementation and distribution of that piece of literature goes to another department who doesn't have the same passion, who doesn't have the same mission, who doesn't feel the need to push it as hard as the people who created it. A good example are some videos made about bicycling by our community about a year and a half ago. They were brilliant little, I think MPO made them. They were brilliant. They were really good. And they were going to be used on city commission meetings in the breaks. They were never used, maybe once. They're still there. They could still be used. They aren't used. This is because the fellow running the thing doesn't have the passion that the MPO and the people who made the video have. And he needs to be told, play that video. And you need to go to Midco and say, here, play this public service announcement. We're not going to give you a choice. You play it. And you have to keep on them, and you have to keep doing it. You can't do it just one time. You have to keep doing it. So your education component is critical. Do a really good job of it if you can. I think it'll make a huge difference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gary.
Well, I think it's 6 o'clock, so we'll wrap up the study session. And if there's any other questions regarding this issue from the commissioners or the public, feel free to shoot those our way. And with that, we'll take a 5-minute break and then start the regular meeting.
We ready? Okay. Everybody, welcome to the Multimodal Transportation Commission meeting. Steve Evans is out sick today, so I'm, as vice chair, I'm going to run the meeting, and this is my first, so y'all keep me in line. So first order of business is approving minutes and for the last commission meeting, December 2nd, and the study session. Can we do those at the same time? That's all the same thing. So do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so minutes are approved by John and Charlie.
Can I vote first?
I'm sorry?
Vote.
Oh, I'm sorry. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, now we're approved. All right, so we have time for public comment, and the public is allowed to speak on items that are not appearing on the agenda tonight. Comments are limited to 3 minutes apiece. So if there are any, is there anybody here that has any public comment right now?
I'm John Goldberg. I want to make sure I understand if I have a comment or question on the parking code subcommittee's report. Wait till then.
There is an agenda item for, is it on an update?
Under commission items.
Commission items? I think it'd be reasonable.
Okay. My request is that you open those subcommittee meetings to the observation of the public. I realize that's not a requirement. I realize you probably don't want to do it, but you asked the city attorney, Tony, at one of the very first meetings about subcommittee meetings, if they were open to the public. She said, you can close them if you want, but I don't advise it because of public trust. You've got a couple of items that are coming under the code, should be coming under your discussion, which haven't been discussed up to this point by the city when they gave you a briefing. It's a request. 3 out of 4 of you should know what my concerns are. Jessica certainly does. And perhaps you'd agree they're valid.
I haven't participated in those discussions either.
Thank you. Is there any other public comment right now? Okay.
Katie Welsh, 732 Rhode Island. I would just say, I go to all the Historic Research Commission meetings, and they have a subcommittee called the Architectural Review Committee. And it's open, it's great. You learn, it's like taking a class. You learn so much about why things are done the way they are and why codes are set up the way they are. So I'm in favor of open meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Moving on to the election, it's time to elect a chair. And so I would like to open nominations for the 2020 Transportation Commission Chair to commission members.
I have a nomination. I would like to nominate Nick. I think he has a lot of interest, a lot of energy that he can contribute to the group.
Thank you. Do nominations just stand? I mean, there's no approval of a nomination.
There will be. We should seek other nominations.
Right, but you don't have to approve just that his name has been put up.
No.
Okay. Okay. Are there any other nominations?
Are you asking if there needs to be a second, or if he needs to accept the nomination? Is that?
Yeah. Is there any formal action for Nick to stand for nomination?
No.
Okay. Okay. Are there other?
I think there may not be a formal request, but it'd be his moment to say no.
Oh.
If that's what you're saying.
In the agenda, it shows that I've expressed interest in this. So far, so good.
This is the railroad.
Yeah.
Are there other nominations? May I nominate? Can I nominate?
Yes.
Oh, all right. I would like to nominate John.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, so Nick and John are standing for a vote for chair. Any other nominations? Okay, so nominations for chair are closed. All in favor of Commissioner Nick for transportation chair, say aye.
Aye.
What's the count?
Should we do hands, maybe?
Yeah.
That was easier to count.
We keep track of who? 3, 4, 5. Okay. And let's see. Any opposed? And then all in favor of John for chair? Aye. Okay. Okay, so it looks like Nick has the vote, and Nick will take over as chair right now.
Okay.
All right.
Would you like me to sit in a central location, or is this okay?
Yeah, if you could sit in the middle.
Okay.
And then,
Actually, I'll scoot this way.
Computer's on life support.
Yeah, mine is too.
Stretched it.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
I just don't.
It's okay.
Okay.
Don't worry about it.
It's done.
All right.
You wanted this.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I don't know if this is necessarily how it works, but as my first statement, I appreciate everybody for putting your trust and confidence in me to lead this commission. It's been an exciting time so far, and I feel like I've learned a lot from you all and from the public and from staff, and to have a successful next 2-ish years of my term, so, or year in this thing, but 2 years from my whole term. So the next step will be to solicit nominations for vice chair.
I'd like to nominate John.
Okay. Do I hear any other nominations? Hearing none, I guess we will move to vote. So all in favor of electing Commissioner Ziegelmeyer as vice chair, say aye and raise your hand, please.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, it is unanimous. Congratulations. Okay. Oof, let me get my head in gear here. Our next item then is the 2020 Transportation Commission Retreat, in which we will be receiving an update.
Yeah, so as those that are on our committee helping plan know, we've created an agenda, which I've attached to the item here, and wanted to get any other feedback from the commission as a whole on the agenda. So we are planning to have the retreat on the full-day retreat will be on Friday, February the 21st at the Carnegie Building. And then we'll have our social get-together on the Saturday before it, February 15th at J. Wilson's. And both meetings are meetings that are open to the public. I do appreciate all of the help that the committee helped out with staff to put together the agenda for the retreat and the input that we received. I think we have a good outline, and we are going to be working on sending out a few pre-retreat survey questions that we're putting together here. So that should be coming out here hopefully this week, which we're going to try to do it online and interactive type deal. And I guess I'd just see if there's any other questions or thoughts on the retreat agenda from the body as a whole.
Are we going to have anyone discussing land use from the staff?
Not in particular. We do have Jessica come to talk about transportation planning, or maybe just plans in general, if there's any questions or discussions on that. But we didn't specifically discuss land use as a topic in the retreat. So if there's any other thoughts on that, Carol, is there a certain issue or subject you want to discuss?
Not a specific issue. I just think it's a bridge we need to cross. We need to have more integration between land use and transportation planning.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I would hope that that would be a part of the final agenda item, the MMTC goals for 2020. I think enough of us have expressed interest in trying to bridge that gap a lot more, so I'm hoping that will take some significant discussion during that, so that, you know, hopefully sometime soon we can get another planning-related person to our study session, for example.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, that's it. Well, thank you.
Can I just quickly ask about RSVPs? How do you want us to, do you want us to do that? We need to know who's all coming. Like it says if spouses, guests are invited.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes, to let you know by a certain time.
Yeah, we'll send out an email to get a head count for that.
Okay.
It just got finalized at the end of last week as far as the details on where. So yeah, we gotta, we'll get that out, and so we can get a good number.
Well, definitely thank you for everybody who put that together, and staff as well, to make this work. And it is a bit of an undertaking, so I appreciate you pulling this together. Is it appropriate to have public comment on an agenda item such as this and the one that came before it? I realize I missed that one as well. So, I mean, if it is, I can allow it.
What's that?
Is it okay to have public comment on the first two agenda items, the elections and the agenda?
Well, it would be, we could get public comment on this item.
Okay.
If there is public comment.
Okay.
Typically, we should get it with each item, but we could certainly open this up to public comment.
Okay.
Before we move on to the next item. There's no action item for this, but certainly, I think it'd be fine to open it up to public comment.
I think mostly my interest in doing so is now having heard about the interest in having more public and open meetings. So if there are any thoughts, then, you know. Do we have any more up here before we turn it over to public comment? Okay. Public comment is open. The rules are basically the same as they are for the general public comment, except for it does have to be about this item, so.
Is this a comment on the retreat?
Yes.
Okay, the public's invited. Where would a person park a bicycle? For 100 years, that building welcomed bicycles. It was renovated. A thing called forward planning comes into play, and all the bicycle parking goes. There are 2 public meetings there, and it's a polling place.
Carnegie Building?
Yeah.
On the east side.
Go park a bike there. Just come down.
This is trees.
Go back and tell. Okay.
Thank you. Any more public comment? Okay. If not, let's move on to item number 3. Receive MPO presentation on the Safe Routes to School Plan update.
Hope you'll excuse me for not standing to this evening to give my presentation, my injury. So we attached on the agenda some of the preliminary work that we've begun doing, putting together the existing conditions, memo, and documentation around our efforts in regards to safe routes to school. And this is just a little bit of process to tell you about where we're at and some of the high-level topics that we're hoping to address in the plan, and I'd be welcome to answer any questions you might have about that once I go through my slides, or any discussion you want to have about any of the topics in more detail. This is a robust process that really began in 2014 with a collaboration and partners at that point in time led by the health department and their work, and when Charlie was working on some of this stuff, so he's intimately familiar with some of the history and where we've been. But with the MPO, the school district, and other city departments. This process, we included sustainability staff and some of the coordination work that we're doing as well. And so we have a staff work group that's been coordinating and working on this planning development process. Through the planning process, something that differed from the last evaluation was we took the opportunity to collect data and evaluate the 23 existing school crossing guard locations. They cross students at about 28 different screen lines because some of them cross at a couple different crossings to get into the school. And out of that preliminary analysis, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about crossing guard policy and some of our thoughts where we're going, only 9 of those meet our current warrants to warrant crossing guards. We explored at the conversation with the parking staff who oversees the school crossing guard program an additional evaluation of 6 more locations with 8 crossings, and 3 of those meet the warrants. And so we are going to have some big issues, I think, to tackle when it comes to school crossing guards. We conducted a parent survey. That was a replica of the pretty similar to the parent survey that was originally conducted in 2015. We didn't get as much turnout. We had about 216 surveys completed as part of that process. We did it online only this time because of the what was perceived some of the lack of manpower to process that, but also the concern about being able to identify that data. The last survey, we got 1,600 responses. So out of that process, we've learned something, which is if we're going to do that, we need to send paper surveys home with parents. And then additionally, after our open house, which we were
had dismal turnout too. We were under-impressed. We had 2 parents represented from all of our schools, and 5 members of the public total. So after our team came back after that open house and really decided that we would be visiting all the either site councils, PTAs, or PTOs based on feedback we got from each of the school, the elementary and middle school principals, how they felt they would best like to, within their school structure, have us participate and gather information. So we started that process in December, and we will go through mid-February of doing all those school site visits. You saw Dustin leave earlier, that's where he was headed, was to a school. And different members of our team have visited different school sites in an effort to share the process with them, where we've been, and also ask them to help us gather and collect information for their schools. So far, we've had about 55 packets turned in, and we've been to about 1/3 of the schools. But many of them have deadlines still open and opportunity to comment either through their paper forms and or online. So that doesn't represent all of the forms and feedback that we intend to get yet. But I think we're well on our way to get some more in-depth feedback. All of those tools are available on our website, the packets and the surveys, if you're interested in looking what we asked each of the schools. In terms of most all of the packets are the same. There's a few specific questions for some specific schools based on things we're considering in some of the route infrastructure considerations. But that process is ongoing, and that kind of leads us into where we believe we'll be, which is the opportunity to analyze from the site visit the rest of the remaining feedback that we anticipate getting, to really conceptualize and finalize the development of strategies based on the feedback provided to us in relation to each school, but also in relation to citywide priorities. We envision that to happen to give us time to be able to do that before the end of the school year, to be able to bring you a draft back by April 6th. So you've seen just tonight the existing conditions. Some of the process that we're looking at, and we realized from the last opportunity to do safe routes, we had 1 safe routes to school map for each school. And it was confusing in the process whether that was planned infrastructure, whether that was telling people how to walk, and it's a user map, and it doesn't have all the details that like maybe a site-specific circulation plan might have. And so as part of this process, we really envision it as a 3-tier process. So we would have, and I'm going to show you an example kind of each one of those plans of what we would have, but of what they look like. So in the first case, this is very similar to what we have now, which is we would envision a safe routes to school infrastructure map with project listings. And that would be like what you've seen when you've seen any of the safe routes to school maps that you've probably seen already, that really establishes the routes, crossing guard locations, posted speed limits. Of course, it would be like a planning tool map. And it would look something like this. Then we would envision, as an option, that we would encourage to work for the schools, like to set up a standard and some examples, which would be a safe routes to school circulation map. And this would be, we've come to realize that many of the schools, some of the schools have varying levels of information and detail that they give to their parents about how they should travel in the different modes around the site. And we kind of envision providing a more standardization of what that might look like, and then provide, if there's off-site considerations, work with city engineers to make sure that we have something that represents what's in the best interest of the traveling public for all modes. And this really doesn't exist consistently across the district, and we're hoping that this is something that will not necessarily be complete as part of the plan process, but will come out of the implementation work of the plan. And then what happened in the last process was the planning maps got used as user maps, and that created some challenges with where we named planned routes for, if you didn't have sidewalk, well, you can't call it a planned route because we don't want to encourage people to use it yet if there's things. So we envision a third set of maps that relates to the other ones, which could encourage people to use safe routes if they're already established and they have existing infrastructure, but also show people where crossings are, where crossing guards might be, where sidewalks exist, where other infrastructure might exist to help them navigate into the school, particularly, if you're doing encouragement events. And so we envision kind of the structure of this plan, of that process, to kind of all work together, and these would all be negotiated, I believe, as part of a school area traffic control policy. As the part of the first planning process, there was a draft policy developed that made it no further than the legal staff, basically between the school district and the city. And so we have some work to do on getting that implemented, and we think that we need to do a little more clarification of these different map types and the intents and purposes and how they serve a safe routes to school planning process and implementation. And then the plan, we really envision focusing the plan around issues, mainly because we recognize that, and there could be other issues. These are just the ones that we have so far from things we've heard in the parent surveys and from the work that we've done since 2015, that obviously traffic control is a huge issue of that. We hope that there can be partnership and work in coordinating the neighborhood traffic management program to benefit safety and comfort around schools. And then also assistance with the circulation map and plan, really helping us implement arrival and dismissal policies around that impact traffic control. We're exploring comfortable crossings. I know we've talked about before, really your desire to see a list of crossing projects that can feed into the non-motorized prioritization policy. As we begun this process, we had desired to do that as part of this process, to generate that project list. It's become very clear that we don't have the data yet to support that project list and support that process. And we're going to be really needing the development of neighborhood traffic management to provide some of that contextual data on neighborhood streets where many of these crossings are happening, for us to be able to go through the process of developing thresholds and warrants for different specific type of crossing improvements, like flashing beacons, hybrid beacons, high crossing visibility, yield lines, and other signage. So we are hoping that that's going to be a work task that has to come out of the plan. We really had hoped it was going to be something we could do within the plan development, but it's not realistic, and we're hoping that we can pair some of that. So we're looking to that. Crossing guards we also talked about in terms of comfortable crossings, and I think we're going to have to evaluate what the community has told us in the tools that we've asked them, because we've asked them some questions about crossings and where they think they need to be appropriate and on what type of streets. And there's desire, which people perceive as need for crossing guards in a lot of places. For example, one parent in the Broken Arrow School District said they need a crossing guard at every crossing along 27th Street. And I think we have to think a little more holistically about how that's probably not realistic, and what maybe they need is really well-developed school school bus, because then you really have a parent crossing at each intersection with the kids if they're envisioning sending them down that corridor. And so that's kind of thinking about solutions like that. But we really do need to delve deeper into who manages crossing guards, who pays for crossing guards, what's the evaluation timeline to more regularly evaluate. I know we had a crossing guard location, for example, that we didn't even have a route where the crossing guard location is, but there was a lot of political clout to keep a crossing guard there, even though we now know it doesn't meet the warrants, nor do we have a route there. So we need to start making some harder decisions, I think, and based on the feedback that we integrate, staff is going to come back with a recommendation in the plan related to that, to those sorts of conversation. Then we realized probably out of this process too, we really need to formalize the structure of working together, of what it means to do integrated and collaborative and continuing safe routes to school planning. And so we're hopefully envisioning that as part of the school area traffic control policy, what that looks like for all of these parties in the long term. Right now we've just formalized a work group around these issues, but there's longer term collaboration that needs to happen for this plan and these processes to be implemented. And so we'll be making some recommendations hopefully about what that might look like. And then we have some other recommendations in general about walking and biking culture. So those things can look like education and encouragement events, curriculum in the schools, integrating in all sorts of curriculums about active transportation, possibly exploring bicycle-friendly driver training programs, and also thinking about walking school buses or bike trains and how we can lead parents to be champions of some of those things where none of the entities can rise up to do that. So, and then looking at some best practices we've seen and kind of presenting those as recommendations. This will be a citywide plan, so it won't have specific school implementation recommendations, but we kind of envision a template for what a school-specific plan would look like that can fit under the framework where champions around each school or schools can use that template and process to develop more localized school-specific strategies they want to take that can collaborate with the bigger picture work that we're doing. We also recognize that there probably needs to be a process for updating and amending the plan, and so we're looking at kind of setting that in the MPO's process for kind of every 5 years, where we have that on the rotation with bike and PED and coordinated transit plans, that many of those happen on that time frame in between long-range plan updates, and so we kind of envision that, with the exception that there does need to be some process on intervening years when school boundary changes happen, or at the request, probably of the school board, or a more formalized process. So we're looking at exploring what our recommendations are kind of in regards to that. That's kind of our initial thought about that in terms of integrating this into a more realistic process. That's kind of what I have to present to you about where we are kind of working and what we're thinking about in terms of that process. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have or hear any feedback you might have of some of the concepts and ideas that I mentioned.
Okay, thanks. Let's see.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You're collecting a lot of data, and that's great. It's hard to collect data on pedestrians. Is that what the packets are for, that you're sending home and trying to communicate, survey, and that sort of thing?
In terms of user data?
Where the pedestrians seem to walk. If they're not controlled, what is their path? And can we use that path, or do we have to redirect the path?
So one of the things that we have in the packet we've given to all the schools is the revised safe routes that we envision. That's the route map, the infrastructure map, where we're saying these are the routes we intend to develop as the priority routes. Recognizing students live on every street in our community, and we have to really start to narrow down where we can make the biggest impact out of schools into networking. So we began that process by reevaluating student addresses for each school and student densities along in that district boundary to really prioritize realistically in that kind of half-mile to 1 mile walking radius where we can look at developing routes. We are asking, as part of that process, we're showing existing routes and showing what our recommended route changes are. Some schools have changes, some schools don't, and asking parents to provide us that feedback. So that would be the process where we would learn about if there's other routes people are taking. Oftentimes, if they're not all the time, but oftentimes some of those routes are more informal routes. They're like, we go through somebody's backyard and we go through this, other way that's like across private property. And so sometimes we can't take advantage of those opportunities. There are some options in some of the schools where we have a choice. Would you prefer the route to be along this trail, which is surrounded by natural environments, or would you rather it be on the street side? And we've asked in those situations where we believe the route meets the intent, we've asked the schools and the participants to weigh in on which route they would prefer to be the official route.
I think we're doing a good job on collecting data. The current concern that's lurking in the back of my mind is that we expect pedestrians to walk up to a corner and flash their lights and turn right. They travel like ants, especially young pedestrians. They're not going to go in a straight line anywhere. And so we don't want to engineer them to try to do that, because they won't.
Yeah, and many places on the street, there's a set path for a pedestrian, no matter their age. And so I think in some of those cases, we need to do a job of educating students of how they need to behave in environments that are more controlled. I get what you're saying, where they're going to walk across the schoolyard, and in some of those places, there's not a risk to doing that because they're not interacting with cars unsafely. But in places that there are risks, that the risk is elevated because of the path, then I think we need to pair education and enforcement in those locations to discourage that behavior.
Anybody else have any questions, comments, discussion points?
After the public, or?
I guess just for right now, and then once we answer a couple questions, kind of
So you'd mentioned,
get going.
you had mentioned avoiding private property. I have a couple of thoughts on, in Lawrence, is there ever consideration of say, working with someone to put in an easement? And the specific place I think of is West Middle School in Sunset. I think I brought this up before. There's a cut through there somewhere already. There's a pedestrian easement or access coming from Sunset, but then trying to remember the neighborhood very well, but the other thing I'm thinking of is kids that walk home from West to on the other side of the golf course. I'm only bringing this up because I went to West and I lived on the other side of the golf course, and there, were many students that we'd all have to walk 2.5 miles or half a mile. And so clearly we all cut between people's houses. So is there any chance that, or is it ever, any parents have brought up in any of those considering something like that? Because it drastically changes in those locations whether a kid can walk to school or not.
I think we would have to look at those on a case-by-case basis to decide if there was going to be an effort to pursue a path through private property, whether that be an easement or development of stuff. I don't know any specifically that are currently on recommended routes, but I think we would explore those if they were presented to us as options and determine if they were feasible or not.
Okay. I think something like that was looked at a few years ago, some bridge or something.
Okay. Anything else from up here before we turn it over to public comment? In that case, public comment it is.
Excuse me, Gary Weber again. Recently did some research on the two schools in our neighborhood, Sunset Hill Elementary and West Junior High, and I'd love to be involved in the process, Jessica. I don't know if that's possible, but just a note, I'd love to be involved. The question I want to ask is about the junior high and high schools. They have large districts, large areas around them that the students, and as you know, anything less than 2.5 miles, there's no bus. Okay, so if you look at the data for these schools, 1/4 mile, most of the kids walk, many of the kids, a good hybrid, and the farther you get away, up to 2.5 miles, fewer and fewer and fewer kids walk, okay? Are you going to integrate the bus routes into your maps? Because what I would like to see is to use every possible connection we can on the buses. So a walking route to the nearest bus stop, and then the route of the bus through that district. So a student whose parents say, I need you to walk home today, can say, look, walk over here to this bus stop, and then you can take 6 down to Wakarusa, and then there's a 1/4 mile to our house. So this is the kind of multimodal transportation that's really critical to get these kids to walk, because if it's more than a 1/4 mile, the parents don't want it and the kids don't want it. So any way you can integrate the bus routes into this and make it so that it's really easy to see, oh, well, I want to go home, I just take this here, take this bus here, walk over here. I think that would really help a lot. And as you know, the transport system now has a very inexpensive student pass, so we need to work with them on this. And then when you do your documents for the parents, then that's when you need to say, look, here's a great option for your kids, $10 a semester. Here's the route. You can figure it out. We'll help you figure it out. In fact, first week of school, we'll have parents come in and do volunteer bus trips with you. And we'll have the parent ride home with 3 or 4 kids just to help you. So I really like to see if there's some way you can possibly integrate the buses into the SRTS school maps. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Any other members of the public who would comment? All right, let's take it back up here. Well, any other questions for, yeah, John?
David, what are you looking for from us? We just received the report?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And any feedback you have, and I think we're shooting for maybe April, maybe May to bring back the final report for approval.
Cool.
I think I appreciate Gary's comment about the integration of the busing. When you were on the slide about issues, that was in my mind, was walking and biking culture. It's about a culture where people don't assume that they have to have a car. And so if there's a way to kind of think more broadly about how does this advance that sort of culture, kind of a non-car dependency culture, especially at the middle school. I mean, I'm in that situation with my oldest now. She's 5th grader, and I've been telling her for about a year she'll get a phone as soon as she learns how to take the bus. And we literally have a 4-month plan for her to get there. And it's tied to her birthday coming up in April, and so we're like about a month behind, because I had the draft to my wife in January, and it was kind of a steady process of getting her to get the pass, develop essentially a plan that she would demonstrate her capacity to use it, and then eventually do a presentation to some of her friends as a way to help encourage, like, yeah, this is a legitimate way we can get ourselves around town. That's just my, parenting style. I do the same with walking, kind of across 6th Street and get to Quill Run. So if there's a way to think about how do we help parents and students begin to learn how to use our bus for an option for how they get around town, that would be super, super helpful. If it's as simple as adding on the encouragement maps, kind of well-established bus stops. I know the routes might change in a 5-year period, but something, even if it's just maybe a couple of the bulleted items that kind of describe that as an option, that could probably be helpful. I do know there's been talk in the past with the school district about how our bus system can help getting kids to and from school. So it does feel like we're not alone in that thinking around how is it that young people can learn how to use a bus system to get around town. And I appreciate, I had emailed Jessica a month or so ago about kind of just querying about the number of bus passes that have been sold. And so I got the latest from you, and it was, it does look like we're getting between 400 and 600 plus passes sold, depending on the semester. So that's really great data for us to know. There's a lot of kids that are, at least their parents are buying them, or somehow they're buying these student bus passes. I was thinking about from the perspective of how much money does this raise? What was the purpose of doing this in the first place? Is the money that's being raised being used to support education for kids to use the bus, or is it going somewhere else? I don't know. I haven't asked those questions yet, but I was starting with, we have 3 years of this now, and I'm wondering what our goal was. And if it's to get more kids to use it, then I wonder how would kids like my daughter, for example, market the bus to their friends. If these 600 or so kids every semester if they could help us think about that, I'd be really curious what they might come up with. And I think this generates, several thousands of dollars every year, so it seems like it could be used to fund education and marketing. Anyway, I think if there's a way to get the bus stuff in there, that'd be great. I'm just really impressed by the progress we've made since this all started way back in those initial conversations that we had that I was part of, and I really like the encouragement map. So, that's the only comment I have tonight on this.
All right. Anybody else? There's no action on this, so once I close the discussion, we are moving on to the next item, which is Mr. Hoskinson. We're doing the East 19th Street, Harper to O'Connell, or is it going to go to you first, Dave? Talk about the date.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And Jason's here to, if there's any other specific questions, but as you know, at the end of last year, we brought forward a number of options for a street section for East 19th Street from Harper to O'Connell. Based off of those discussions and previous conversations, the neighborhood has asked us to consider a 22-foot wide street with open ditches. And so the city commission gave us some direction to proceed with providing that design option. I wanted to, before we moved forward with that additional option, just to present the scope of that option to the public, this body, to see if there was any feedback or just to have clear just to show that what we're doing, clarity on what we're doing. So staff met with some of the neighbors. Michael Allman helped organize a group meeting, and we met with them. I think have a good understanding of what we're proceeding with. And so we've outlined in the scope of services some of the main general things that we're going to be looking at with the 22-foot wide street. We did discuss that we still can use any bike facility with any of these street options, whether it's a cycle track or on-street bike lanes or a shared use path. And so for the purpose of this concept, I think we've agreed to show a 10-foot shared use path on the south side and a 5-foot sidewalk on the north side. Of course, those could be interchanged with, as I mentioned, to achieve the fire code issue with having a 26-foot wide street. We are going to be looking at least having shoulders wide enough that we could meet that 26-foot wide width adjacent to fire hydrants, which is a fire code issue. So we're going to include that, and then do our design for the open ditch channels based on our stormwater management criteria. And so we will be proceeding with this design option, and Jason's going to provide the typical section and look at the stormwater, and then we're going to bring back that option as soon as next month, if not in April, back to this group before we go to the city commission and get some guidance on moving forward with some width of street design. And so with that, that's the update. So if there's any comments from or questions from the commission, welcome those, or if not, just open it up to the public for any feedback too.
I flipped back to my notes from the first meeting, and at that time, I stated that bottom line is the street is in disrepair and needs to be replaced. The whole connection to the O'Connell Road, I think, is a real problem. the recent consideration of the city putting their heavy equipment out there is just an example of what could become of that street. And the street is not intended for that kind of traffic. So my first suggestion is don't connect to O'Connell Road until we know what we're doing. My second suggestion is to minimize what we're doing to O'Connell Road so that we do not have a truck route, because that will become a truck route. And there are neighborhoods on both sides. I think one crosswalk is not enough. Between Park Hill and Indian Hills, those two neighborhoods, kids run back and forth all the time. And so we do have pedestrian islands, and that helps so that they can get across the street safely. And we need to do something on East 19th similar to that to protect the pedestrians. The kids, the pedestrians, they need to get across the street. Those are my comments.
Do you have any comments from this side? I don't know if we really have anybody chomping at the bit to go down the line, so just kind of if it comes to you.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear the public's comment if we don't have any questions of staff.
Doesn't sound like we do, so. Although I did have a quick thing, just a technicality. I do recall, I think it was in the city commission where this was brought up with the fire chief, I want to say, who said that the minimum width was something like 20 feet. I can't find for the life of me where the actual 27-foot number came from. I'm probably looking in the wrong place, but any guidance as to where that's from, because I don't think this is the last time we'll see this. So I guess if anybody knows what part of the International Fire Code the 27-foot clearance is from?
The 26-foot clearance was for adjacent to fire hydrants along the street. I think the 20-foot width is access aisles.
Okay.
So for instance, a fire lane around a building, that would need to be a minimum of 20 feet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's it. Okay, 26 feet. That's what it was. Right. Okay, thank you. Well, with that, turn it over to the members of the public for any comment.
Well, once again, in this case, speaking for the 19th Street Neighborhoods Coalition, David mentioned that engineering staff, he and one other engineer, and the coalition met at his request to go over the expectations and the understanding of, what it was that the coalition had in mind, and so we would understand what the engineering staff had in mind. And it was a very productive meeting as far as we're concerned, and I think staff would agree. Far as I would say, I think the viewpoint of the coalition and the viewpoint of engineering staff is congruent, as in the memorandum of understanding. I think it's about 95% of this memorandum, and I emailed this to all of you, so you should have had a copy of that. But there are 5% of these items that were still unresolved or gray areas or whatever. And I'll just touch on two of them. One was what Commissioner Bowen mentioned about crossings, pedestrian crossings, that the scope at this point indicates one pedestrian crossing at the quarter-mile mark. It's a half-mile street we're talking about from Harper to O'Connell. So at the quarter-mile, right in the middle, would be one crossing. The coalition would like to see 3 crossings at least. What we talked about and indicated in the memorandum of understanding was raised crosswalks, but they don't necessarily have to be raised, but we figured if they are raised, they would have a dual function of being a speed hump. So that's why we prefer that. That's kind of unresolved, I think, in our understanding. The other is, as Commissioner Bowen, thank you once again, pointed out, the connection at O'Connell Road. We've been, for 4 years now, well, going on 5, wanting to see two things. No connection at O'Connell Road was our initial position, and a 22-foot wide street. With the discussion over the years with fire department, police, chamber, I mean, various people participating in this, that connection became a very important thing for some of the stakeholders. So our position then adjusted to accommodate some of those issues from the fire department, the police department, Venture Park, to a partial closure or a gate or anything other than having a direct connection just wide open, particularly when the street was being considered as 47 feet. The reason being cut-through traffic to the neighborhood, commuter traffic, game day traffic, various things. But now, within the last year, added to that mix, which was already of concern for the coalition, all the neighbors on 19th Street, was the field operations facility for MSO department, which would put all of the utility vehicles, the trash trucks, construction vehicles, whatever, north of Venture Business Park at the farmland property, with specification that that primary access be on O'Connell Road to 23rd, which is good. We're for that. However, there's nothing saying that when these vehicles reach that intersection, which is a dogleg intersection at O'Connell, that they will all 100% every day go south on O'Connell Road. You know, what's to stop them? So that's why we're had this additional concern now with this new possibility, and it is a possibility. We're not sure at this point whether that will be located there. But it just brings up the concern once again that we feel that there needs to be the scope of this project to include some consideration of some kind of a treatment, at least a partial closure. Engineering staff does not want to see that because it is a collector street. It was reduced from being an arterial to a collector at our request. We appreciate that. But we have been saying all along that this is a residential street, just like the rest of 19th, although it's called a collector. It functions as a residential street. Primarily, there are 250, whatever more, homes out there on that part of 19th. Other than that, there are 3 homes on 19th Street, and then it's institutions, church, animal shelter. There's 1 used auto parts. Primarily, it's residential. So that's why we feel that it needs to be 22 feet, and there needs to be some address of the flow of traffic from O'Connell. So anyway, we just wanted to bring that up. We would appreciate it if this commission would suggest that the scope of this particular option includes some consideration of a closure, partial closure. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Any questions? I'd be happy to entertain them.
Okay. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.
Any other public comment? Okay. Let's bring it back up here. Any comment from commissioners? I guess I have kind of a question here. This has been brought up both from up here and from out there as well, as to the closure, partial closure, restriction of some sort at the interface of 19th Street when it hits O'Connell. Is that in this? I mean, that's probably not in the scope of the consultant necessarily. That's more of a city issue, right? So, what thought have you guys given to it? I mean, you've heard it obviously. I don't know if I recall what thoughts you've had so far.
We've had a lot of discussions on that going back probably two years ago, before we started looking at the design options. We had heard the same concerns and feedback from the neighborhood on looking at a closure there. We do feel, we had a lot of discussions on the need to provide full access connectivity before we started the original concept design for the project, being that it's a collector street, intersecting to another collector street, which is O'Connell. Discuss the need for fire and emergency vehicle access, and really the need to have public traffic accessing Venture Park for work or business to the adjacent neighborhoods. And so I think, as far as our transportation planning goes, and we've always considered it being a future street. We did, in our discussions and listening to the neighbors, did downgrade the classification to a collector street. But we do feel that would be appropriate to provide a full connection, both east and west traffic. And so as far as that's concerned, I think we've kind of, in my opinion, crossed that. Okay. Even though others may still want to see it, we're not going to recommend that. And so that is, showing that is not included in this extra concept design with the 22-foot wide street. Okay. I would say, going back to Michael's other point on the crossings, there's no specific 1 or 3 crossings in the scope. If there's a need to have 3 pedestrian crossings, that you can have 3 pedestrian crossings with any of the design options. That type of feedback is, when we go through the process of getting feedback from the neighbors on the project, we want to hear, is there a need to have crossing? Where's the need to have the crossings? Where should they be? That can be incorporated into any of the design options as far as the street width goes. So I think when we presented the 5 options a couple months ago, we showed a mid-block crossing halfway between O'Connell and Harper. If it was more appropriate to have multiple crossings that can be added to any of the design options, so we're not, staff's not opposed to having more pedestrian crossings if they're needed.
Okay. So in that case, I feel like it's probably more appropriate at this time, really, we're being shown the supplemental agreement. We're not necessarily being shown broader aspects of the project. It's really just the change order, more or less. So, right.
Yeah, and it's a minimal cost. It's we don't take these small cost change orders through the city commission, so we could process it administratively. But just for transparency, we thought it would be good just to put it on the agenda, just to have it out there, and so everyone could see it. And if there was something else that we were missing, that we could get that feedback. So I think even though there are maybe some points that we don't agree on as far as connection, that we're still, I think, for the most part, in agreement of what we're going to be providing, that the 22-foot wide street, we're going to look at the shoulders to provide the fire access, and show the open storm sewer ditch design for drainage. So,
yeah, and I certainly appreciate the transparency and also the collaboration as well. I feel like all parties have had their concerns listened to, at least maybe not 100%, but much more than 0. And I think that sets a really good precedent for doing, these kind of projects in the future. So much appreciated. So any other comment from up here? And if not, then that's it. Thank you for the update. And with that, are there any staff items? Okay. Nope. Not a ton of commission items. Guess I'm kind of across all of these, aren't I? All right, well, I'll start with PTAC. There has not been a meeting since, was it?
November.
December? November, okay. It's all, the holidays are all kind of a blur to me, so it feels like a while, and I guess it has been a while. I believe we're still in the process of hiring the new transit director, right? Has that happened yet?
I believe an offer has been made.
How exciting.
So we are
Okay.
in the process.
Yay.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Well, that's it for PTAC, right? On the Micromobility Committee update. Let's see where we are.
And I can help out with that too if you need.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I wanted to put that on there. So as we had established this Micromobility Committee last year, and the first thing that we did was look at the shared scooters. We kind of made a point to look at that first. And so we did have another meeting with that committee last month to start talking about next steps, which includes a little of continuing to review the shared scooter progress as we have an update on that as we just closed the RFQ process last Friday, and we had 3 submittals on that. And so that will move forward for staff to review and provide a recommendation on that. And in the meantime, we will continue to look at appropriate code language that would go with that, the shared scooters. And so we did talk a little bit about that at our last Micromobility Committee meeting, but also looking forward to other devices that may be appropriate to review what is allowed currently under city or state statute, and maybe if there's any other clarifications that need to be made on other items, specifically motorized skateboards, as we had got that request last year and kind of tabled that discussion. And so just generally speaking with this last meeting, as those that were there remember that we just kind of recapped where we're at and sent out that we had a table of all these different items that were defined in state statute that I think the whole commission reviewed going way back last year. But to take a look at that again to see if there's any other vehicles that are defined in there that we may want to start looking at. And then I think ultimately having some type of guide or something that we could publish that kind of outlines for the public the different transportation devices and where they can be used in the city and the regulations on those. So
yep,
that's kind of where we're at, I think, on that.
I'd like to add just one thing on that I thought was an important point in our last discussion was as people use multiple different, as they're using sidewalks for not just walking or running, but also riding their bikes or riding a scooter or a skateboard or just the list goes on, that we need to give consideration to the most vulnerable user of sidewalks and think about how does that user have clear right of way. And there are some places in the country where they have been very clear about the kind of the delineation of right of way on a sidewalk. It didn't seem like that was something that our current city code addresses so well. So maybe we need to get into, how do we get clear, like if you're on a bike on a sidewalk, you need to yield to someone who's, more vulnerable than you. Right. And that's maybe hard to define, but we all kind of probably recognize it. Like if you're on a, device that is heavy and you're going at high speed, you are more dangerous than someone who's slowly walking and maybe only weighs 80 pounds. So how do we get the right code set that right of way is clear to people that are sharing sidewalks?
I believe part of the plan of that, I think we did, direct staff to include some kind of language like that. Is that right, Dave? To see like how we could just say, priority must be given, the right-of-way must be yielded to pedestrians, for example. I think that will be part of the ordinance, right?
Yeah, we got some examples on that we're gonna consider with the ordinance.
But I thought that was really helpful because right now, by law, you could ride a bike on a sidewalk,
Yeah.
except in the central business district, which, we define as our downtown area, and that, by extension, the area of North Lawrence that's now part of downtown. So just our current reality is we have mixed users on a sidewalk, and best judgment, doesn't always prevail. So there has to be probably some way to say, hey, we have code that tells us you were in the wrong by driving over the top or riding your bike over the top of someone, essentially.
Yeah.
And then, I think in that discussion, for me at least, what was clarified was, or maybe it wasn't the discussion, but in the kind of reading about this, when someone is on a sidewalk, if they're using their bicycle, they have to follow pedestrian rules. If they're on the road using their bicycle, they have to follow rules that other users of the road use. So that was helpful. I mean, when I've seen people ride their bikes without stopping at an intersection, I've been puzzled over that. Like, what is the rule? And I see someone walking across an intersection, and they're using the crosswalk, whether it's marked or not, they're using a crosswalk. And we don't question that. So I actually think, and I could be wrong because this is still me trying to understand this. If you're on a bicycle on the sidewalk, I don't think you have to stop if there's a stop sign, because the stop sign is regulating the users of the roadway, not the users of the sidewalk. So if you're a cyclist and you want to just go right through a red light, get on the sidewalk, and I think you're fully compliant with the law. Maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, as long as you're not crossing on a don't walk signal.
Not at a red light,
Yeah.
but at a stop sign, pedestrians aren't expected to stop.
There's some odd artifacts when you allow bikes on sidewalks. And I think
There
it
are.
made sense back when there weren't a lot of bike lanes, but I think we're getting to the point where it no longer makes as much sense. And I think that's going to be part of our eventual job with this Micromobility Committee, because bikes and scooters are pretty similar in terms of speed, height.
Yeah.
They're only different in where you see the lights on. I mean, say rear light on a scooter is like 2 inches off the ground. On a bike, it's actually kind of visible. But overall, they share similar challenges. And I think hopefully we're going to start digging into a little bit better this idea of bikes on the sidewalk, because it doesn't sit well in a lot of parts of town. And I agree, it doesn't really make sense in a lot of places. But it's also too confusing to have, well, bikes can go on these sidewalks, but not these sidewalks. And at this time of day, but not in this direction.
Well,
you got to keep it simple, or otherwise it'll be impossible to.
I think it's pretty simple. Right now, bikes need to follow the pedestrian rules on a sidewalk. They need to follow road rules on the road. If you start to say that certain places of town you can't ride on a sidewalk, I think that's a problem as our current transportation system is designed. And thinking about families with young children, most parents are not comfortable with their children riding on the road. So sidewalks have a particularly important function for those families.
I have a staff item. Are we still working on micromobility? There's something I want to ask about. It actually kind of might have a little to do with that, but
If
I
it
mean, not
has
a
to do with
staff item,
micromobility.
obviously a commission item.
Yeah, I mean, if it has to do with micromobility.
It does. Well, it more talks about busing, biking, and walking, but I'll just.
So be it.
I'll
allow it.
Well, so here's the deal. I got an email today from a young woman who is taking a 3-minute, is going to talk to City Commission tomorrow, but it was a multimodal thing, and she asked me to read it tonight, and I was wondering if that would be okay for me to do.
Let's see the agenda.
It's more of a
Would you mind if
national bike to work thing.
Okay. Would you mind if we did it right? I think we're almost wrapped up with micromobility.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
that's what I was asking if we
Yeah.
were.
So the only other comment I had was that one of the other things that I believe was brought up at our last meeting was that the relationship we have to, say, the public, the media, stakeholders, and how proactive that relationship is, did come up as well after the editorial in the Lawrence Journal World. So that was brought up, and I don't know where it stands at this point. I think there was some talk between the communications team and the city, so I don't know what happened there, but I think what we started to realize is that it may behoove us to be a little bit more proactive and, I guess, explanatory of the benefits of scooters, because most people are, it's very human to not be okay with change. And even if that change has benefits, there are two sides of the story, basically, is what I'm saying. And I think a lot of the public perception is based on horror stories from other cities. And though a lot of those are true, there are also benefits to having a very easy to access, low cost electric method to get around. So I think and we haven't gotten to what that strategy is yet, but that's probably going to come up in a future meeting for how do we best interface with the public. Is it MMTC's role to be kind of a cheerleader of stuff that we champion, and if so, what form does that take? So that's the kind of thing that will probably come up at the retreat as well, because I believe Steve has brought that up before, and I think, Charlie, you have as well. It's like, how far do we go, How much can we be our own proponents of what we decide on up here? With that, please.
Speaking of cheerleading. So I got this from Kira McPherson today, or McPherson. And this is just a request she's taking at City Commission tomorrow, but I thought it was made sense to read here. So February 14th is National Bike to Work in the Winter Day. Some cities seem to do this on the regular. I can't find any info as to whether or not Lawrence does this or has done this before. I'm not specifically trying to get this day going. My interest lies in getting the commissioners to commit to taking the city bus for work and errands for 1 week in each season, starting with winter, and to bike to work and errands for 1 week in each season. I'm reading this verbatim, but she wrote this fast. So they passed the Sustainability Board proposal for 100% clean renewable energy by 2030, which is huge, but it's just a first step in greening Lawrence. Our city infrastructure has to have and support free, massively used busing, and has to have citywide bike lanes that are real lanes, reinforced from traffic, and lanes that are everywhere, not just a few roads, in order to work on our drawdown and not add to our already lethally overdrawn greenhouse gas budget. A few years ago, some politicians did a challenge where they tried to live on food stamps for a week. This is where I got the idea. It's one thing to be sympathetic to a cause, another entirely to struggle to work and live within certain challenges. Excuse me. Some of the actions I do don't necessarily need a ton of public support, but this one really does. Anything you guys can do to spread the word and amplify the challenge would really help me. It would be great if people could show up tomorrow night and speak in favor of the challenge. It's not a formal presentation. I'm speaking per usual during the 3-minute open public comment section, probably from 6 to 6:15 timing-wise. I haven't written my 3 minutes yet, but I'm going to emphasize that they need to do the bike and bus challenge for at least 7 days in the winter. But the days don't need to be consecutive. Indeed, they can't be all in a row, as Lawrence doesn't have city busing on Sunday. But I want them to prove that they not only did it, but that they did it at least one day in bad winter weather, one day in bad summer weather, and at least one really early in the morning and late at night. If anyone has any ideas about PR or accountability or modifying the challenge, please email me. I need all the ideas and help I can get with this one. I was even thinking about making a chart, almost like a job chart for little kids, where counselors have to check stuff off. I don't know how to get the Lawrence Journal World to cover or support this idea. They seem to not be very climate action friendly or aware, in spite of my efforts to loop them in. I'm not on Facebook or Instagram, but maybe someone who is could make pages or groups or whatever and offer to keep it updated. I want the council to see it's up to the city to design a system that supports its citizen, and green options like busing and biking aren't currently workable in Lawrence. Painting a picture of a bike on a pitifully widened road and hoping for the best is absolutely ridiculous. Every time I've tried to ride my bike for errands, I've almost been hit by a car. Literally, every time. Every time I've tried to take the bus for different jobs and errands, it's taken me hours out of my way and off my schedule. And when I work early or late, I'm flat out of luck. So I'm in my car. This kind of change has to come from the city and county. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Setting people up to fail and then criticizing them for failing is my least favorite thing in the world. We can't ask people to live greener lives if our cities don't support us. We deserve the kind of biking and busing that is so protected and so intelligently designed that everyone does it because it's not just the greenest option, it's the easiest option. I think that if our commissioners and eventual municipal heads and maybe even developers do this challenge over the next year, they will trade temporary inconvenience for valuable clarity and insights that are required of our leaders during our climate crisis. Keep in mind that climate change is an effect amplifier. Excuse me. Snowy days will be snowier, rainy days will be rainier, hot days will be hotter. We don't even have a citywide weather-protected bus shelters, let alone citywide reinforced bike lanes, let alone citywide easily accessible and user-friendly buses. It can't be overstated how important green public transportation is to our climate action plans. Please message me if you've got any questions or ideas. Please spread the word so we can not just issue the challenge, but follow through over the next year. Hope this is semi-coherent, writing it on the run. Sorry that's so long, but I already beat it, so.
Kind of remind me a little bit of car-free challenges. Or car-free Fridays. I mean, there's different ways of kind of marketing. Like, how do you understand the perspective of people that don't rely or don't have access to cars? It's an intriguing idea. I think it maybe speaks a little bit to the comment Nick made about, like, what is our role? And we've kind of queued that up for the retreat. Like, what is the right role for us to have in the community? And do we sponsor things such as this to help people understand, help even ourselves understand the perspective of people in our community that can't or just, don't have the option to really own a car and enjoy the conveniences that provides them.
I think some of those questions are going to be on the questionnaire you're going to get on what our role is. So
I would offer to do that challenge, but I'm not sure how impressive it would be for a millennial, able-bodied white guy with no children to do it.
Yeah.
Who lives near downtown, like, whoa,
But I think
real sacrifice there.
I think her thing is saying basically for anyone to do it and see what it's like to do in the middle of the winter. I mean,
Yeah.
I used to do that. When I moved back to town, I used to do this stuff all the time, and I have to say I do it less and less and less. But partly for the reasons she mentioned. The bus doesn't run. And now it does for me. It runs till 10:30, and that usually works. But almost being hit by a car. So she lists a lot of the same reasons other people do, and she clearly has access to a car. So I think she's asking the commissioners to do it to see how hard it is to do for an able-bodied person. So.
Could we publicize this somehow?
Yeah.
Because I'd be willing to try it out for a full week if I.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it, but I can forward it. I got it maybe 3 hours ago, so something like that. A little 3:37. Sure.
Well, I think that also, for those that aren't using the bus, there's a lot to learn. Like if our meeting goes to 8 o'clock, then if someone's here that relies on a bus to get back home, it's not going to work out very well for them. And
Not only that, the bus doesn't go to City Hall.
well, I mapped it out. I was trying to think, how would I get home tonight if I had to without my car? And you're right, I have to walk. I forget how many minutes it told me I'd have to walk, but yeah. I was reading something recently about perspective, kind of this process of both taking in perspective but also giving perspective, and the sharing of others' perspectives was kind of seen as the most valuable part. So it might be interesting also to think about if we were to do something like this ourselves, how would we communicate our experience about, trying to survive without a car for a week? I would have some real challenges, given that I'm the primary driver for 2 little girls.
Yeah. It'd be a lot harder.
Yeah, definitely.
I tried the bus thing right after we came back, and I started getting involved in all this, and I actually would get a ride to the health department for meetings, and it'd take me an hour and a half to get home by bus and an hour and a half to walk, so I just walked.
Yeah, we have a pretty
Couldn't
tight.
do that now.
We have a tight schedule that I'd
Yeah.
have to upend my world
hours.
not to have a car.
On the bus would not work, no.
Would this be
Uber.
something that we could propose to city communications to see how we could publicize it? I mean, there's a lot of social
I think save it for the retreat. Let's think about this.
Sounds
I mean, this gets to the idea, like, what should we be doing
Yeah. It'll still be
to
cold there.
advance that culture?
In fact, it'll be colder probably, so. Sounds good.
So she's taking this to city commission tomorrow night.
That is a good segue, because you said the idea about public transit, biking, and pedestrian, that needs to be the easiest option. Well, that dovetails pretty nicely with planning and development, because we can only do so much as a transportation commission if we don't control parking standards or density or mixed use. I mean, it makes much more sense to do multimodal transit when you're not in a sprawly suburban development pattern. So that leads me to parking standards. That is in our court at this point. I need to draft up some questions. Is that them?
This is just what we
Yeah. I mean, those could pretty
pass
easily.
back and forth online.
Yeah, I mean, a couple question marks could be added, and that would be basically what we're asking. So where we are at this point, we have discussed basically comparing what the proposed modifications to the parking and loading and access standards were compared to Plan 2040. And in general, the overriding concern was that there are some misalignments, shall we say, or at least we felt that there were misalignments. So our next step is to pose those concerns, questions to planning and the city in general, and then from there take it back to this body to discuss what we came up with, and then pass that back to the planning commission. Is that the right trajectory that was coming up?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think the planning commission is going to review it in March, so we would bring back the summary at our next meeting, beginning of March.
Okay.
I think we should give some examples for those folks who aren't on the committee.
Oh, I think this was a really,
I could read it. It's a lot of reading, too.
well, I mean, I think
The guts of it, though, that whole
I think what stood out for me was the more you understand, well, first of all, what was really clarifying is when we think about parking, just in the broad way, we think about parking, this text amendment doesn't address all of parking. It's very specific around parking that's off-street, that is used in site plan development. So we constantly wanted to talk about parking in a broader way, and we recognize that transportation and parking are pretty integrated. So, it was difficult sometimes because we would want to talk about parking, which is what the lay public would probably do. But this text amendment is really clear. It's not about the totality of parking. So I took from that is, probably we need to have a more active role in discussions about parking in the community. And it's bigger than what the Planning Commission is able to take on, because their role in parking is really around, someone has a development proposal, and they have to ensure that there's adequate parking for that particular use of land. And parking in its biggest sense is, how many things are going to use our road, and where are they going to be stored, and what's the best way to manage all that. And I realize we're bringing probably a bigger perspective to that conversation. So it felt like a bit of a disconnect, and we need to think what's our role around parking management, managing a limited resource. And a lot of that resource is actually in the public right-of-way. That does feel within our scope. The road has a lot of parking slots. So that to me was one of those, okay, I need to go study this a lot more, understand, what does it mean to manage parking well in a community, in the public right-of-way, which the site plan development really deals with the private property and the public's expectation of how much parking will be available on that private property.
But to be fair, they're pretty inextricably linked. I mean,
they are, and I think that's where it's like you really can't. To do this well, we got to see the whole picture, and not just keep ourselves contained to how should this, parcel be appropriately developed to provide storage for vehicles?
So I'd like to bring up a more specific example. I know I missed the last meeting, so shut me down if I'm wrong. But on a site development plan, the suggestion was to widen the parking spots.
Yeah.
And we said, wait a minute, the city is headed for infill, urban infill, and more density. Widening the parking spots means the parking lots would have to be bigger. Another requirement was that there was a minimum requirement of parking spots. And we were thinking, why? If a developer doesn't need the parking spots, let the developer decide how many parking spots they need for their development. But then you get into issues outside of the development where parking might end up in the street. And that's where we ended up in a conundrum. But I thought it was pretty exciting. We were talking about, wait a minute, we don't want to make our parking ramps bigger. And if the cars are bigger, drivers are just going to have to think, can I really fit that into a parking spot in Lawrence, Kansas?
Do I need an F-550 crew cab dually? Probably
Yes.
not, unless I'm hauling 18 hay bales,
And I think that is kind of a conundrum, because what I look at it as the last community I lived in an effort to, they were trying to make cars smaller, basically. They were kind of saying, hey, if you want to be able to park here, your car's got to be able to fit in this spot. So they took parking spots, I believe, were 8 feet. They were a foot narrower than the standard, and they were tight. And I have to say, my current van, all the scratches on it were from there, not from here. And so there is that. And we live in a very different community than that one, so you do have people hauling hay bales more. Those are all issues, but I think what we were kind of looking at was when you look at the aspirations of Plan 2040, it seems like it doesn't make sense to say, well, cars are getting bigger now, so we're going to make the spots bigger, which, I just listened to this thing on cars got smaller for the last decade. They're not actually getting bigger, they're getting smaller. For the past decade, they've been gotten smaller. We're not driving Hummers anymore. Of course, now I hear they have an electric one, so who knows? But so then there's that. I won't be buying one, but there were a lot of things like that came up, and I don't know. Maybe was there another meeting, the one that Carol didn't go to? That never happened. So there was just the one on December 21st.
Yep.
But there were a lot of things that we came across, like there were some things we were kind of excited about that we thought aligned well. But there were things that, like, the other thing that came up was revising grade school parking to be based on size of the assembly area, because that's one of those that you mentioned. If you're looking at site plans, well, now anytime you update a school, even if it's existing school and it's all based on assembly area, you're going to have to meet that.
I think part of this, what I realize is we have when we think about parking, it's much bigger than a particular site plan. And so how do we have this a more holistic approach to parking management? And what intrigued me in kind of the follow-up kind of reading I did was this idea of a parking benefit district, where essentially people that are visitors to an area are paying to be able to park in on-street parking, and the money that's earned in that neighborhood is used for neighborhood projects and also for improvements to the transportation infrastructure in that neighborhood. It's very intriguing, especially in areas where we know there's a lot of visitor parking on neighborhood streets. It seemed different to me than this idea of permitting on-street parking, which felt a little more like we're going to charge our neighbors so they can park in their neighborhood. That feels like you're putting a burden on the neighborhood, but a parking benefit district felt like, oh, now there's a real benefit to letting someone pay to park here because it's going to help improve our neighborhood. And that is way beyond the Planning Commission's work around how to approve or not approve a site plan. So I feel like we have a role in parking that's maybe different from the planning commission. But if they change their parking minimum standards or eliminate that minimum standard, it even puts more parking inside our scope.
Yeah.
And so that felt, I don't know, it was exciting on one hand because it felt like there was maybe more work that we needed to take on. But it also felt like, well, 2 years of this text amendment being drafted, where do you just call whatever, is our project to get that deferred even longer, or are we going to recognize we have another piece of work to do that follows that piece of work?
Yeah, and I think this should definitely lead into more discussions at the retreat on what's our role? Is parking going to be part of our scope? Is that something the city is willing to give to us? Is that something the planning commission is willing to share? Is that something we're willing to take on? I mean, parking is a lightning rod topic. Are we willing to go that route? So yeah,
I guess at this juncture, I am curious what the commission, if they want us to go in any particular direction.
Yeah, that's a good
We are making little waves. Are we comfortable with that as a commission?
So before we go there, basically the next step is to kind of vet some of these questions that we've had and make sure that we're barking up the right tree, basically, with the staff. And then once they kind of steer us in the correct direction, then we'll bring it back to the commission for a more educated discussion. Once it's not just us saying what we like or didn't like, it's actually the staff saying why it was. So I think to have a more informed discussion, I'll have to go through them first.
Okay.
And then come back to us to be more effective that way. So, but if anybody has any comments in the meantime, we won't stop you. So, but since this is a
Donna,
commission item,
I'm curious, Donna, what thoughts you have?
I'm like, I do parking for my day job.
Yeah, I know. That's why I was curious. Like,
On campus, there's sort of a captive audience, and I can create rules and regulations to form that. I had never thought in the neighborhood parking program that you're talking about of the opposite. I mean, you just totally flipped my brain.
No, it blew my brain. It was the guy from UCLA. Aaron, what's his name?
Donald Shoup.
Donald Shoup.
Yes.
He has some very simple ideas how to think differently about parking.
Right.
And we need to probably have that discussion openly about how do we manage this.
Yeah.
And it's a limited resource. It actually is a land use question.
That's right. And if you make it free and available, you really invite more, and especially being the neighbor to the campus, because I've got people who are trying to not pay. And so whatever the city does, if the city starts to regulate that, it also will impact, do I have enough capacity? Because it, would chase them back to campus. So which is why, we've changed our name to Transportation Services to try to embrace that multimodal. You've got lots of options. You don't have to drive a car to campus.
Yeah.
So it's a mixed bag, because parking really pays the bills for the transit side. The students also, they tax themselves. But to have that parking resource to be able to put towards, you got other options, has been, just really eye-opening for me, because I've been in parking for a long, long time, and it's just been parking, and everybody had a car.
Right. Yeah, it's considered a free thing.
On campus, it's not.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of the Donald Shoup.
Yes. Right, if you just keep building it, you can't keep it's hard to feed that monster.
okay. Are there any other items from the commission in general?
I have my notes.
Okay.
There's an urban growth study getting started. I don't remember, was that a city commission directive?
I think it's called fiscal sustainability, maybe.
Well,
but it's basically about urban.
Right.
I know what you mean.
Transportation costs should be part of that study. We need to make sure our foot's in the door. And the example that comes to my mind is Queens Road. There's a lot of personal costs there, and there's a lot of public costs there. And it's on the edge of the city. I'm not too familiar with it, but that's cost. That's the cost of growth. I've noticed that we've started to use the term comfort level, and I think we should continue using that for all different types of transportation. It was used in the bicycle report. And Steve used it when he was describing his comfort level when driving on a narrow street. So I think we need to just think about that for all our modes of transportation. I already gave you my little math. And I want us to think about our priorities. I'm back on the library again. Every time I go to the library, there's a herd of people walking straight from the buses across to the library. In our infinite wisdom, we say we can't do anything about it because of visibility with buses. Now, whenever we have a situation where we see a lot of vehicles, we say, oh, we need another lane, or we need to put in a better traffic light. But when we're thinking about cyclists or we're thinking about pedestrians, we don't think that way. We just think they're wrong. Go ahead, I'm done.
I'm assuming, I think we discussed this, but I'm assuming there's some criteria that is not met there for visibility standards and stuff, so that there couldn't be a mid-block crossing where the buses are.
I don't believe so. I mean, I don't know if, I think maybe we've put off making any permanent improvements until we figured out where the bus hub was going to be. I know that's come up before, and I think that was what we decided with that. So it's not a visibility issue.
Okay.
And there may be the
conversation I recall in regards to the mid-block crossing from the library to the downtown transfer center is that the site layout of the block and the contingency around the parking places and the handicap spaces in relationship to the library limited some of the ability of where you would put a mid-block crossing because of some of those requirements in regards to the site plan with the library. I think there's also the conversation that Dave was mentioning, which is I think for so long we've been in limbo in the process of developing a transit center that we haven't really been willing or hadn't at this point made improvements to what is currently the downtown transfer point.
Well, I brought that up because of the library, but also as an example of how we need to watch our priorities. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay. With that, move on to the calendar. As Dave was going over earlier, we do have the two-part retreat coming up soon. The social will be on February 15th, 5:30 to 7:30 at J. Wilson's. And the actual retreat itself will be on February 21st. I believe that's a Friday, 8:15 to 4 p.m. Public is invited, right? So come on out if you want to join us for a transit palooza all day. It's going to be good. And for the 2020 calendar, it is attached on the agenda, so look over it if you choose to. Anything, John? Looks like on next month, we're going to have a transition plan for the ADA in our study session. And then for the regular meeting, another update on NTMP and neighborhood speed limits and East 19th Street, but also the street maintenance program. That should be interesting. We'll be deep into winter at that point, so. Sounds good. Any questions on the schedule? If not, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So I move we adjourn.
I'm going to say that's a second,
Okay.
just chronologically. All in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
All right. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
You don't watch the basketball game.
Okay.
Oh, gosh, I know.
Since I had to get my dang tickets up.
Oh.
Okay.